where we are tonight is Jonah chapter 4. Okay? So, with Jonah, oftentimes when people think of the story of Jonah, they think that Jonah kind of ends right at chapter 2. And that is, you got Jonah, who's a prophet, who runs away from the Lord, catches a ship going off to Tarshish, and then the Lord sends the storm. The sailors figure out that he's running from the Lord. They throw him overboard. He's swallowed by a great fish, and then he's spat up on the shore. Okay? And so for a lot of people, that's the end of the story. But, Jonah does not end in chapter 2. We got chapter 3. In chapter 3 is kind of the I'm not going to say the climax of the story, but I mean, it is the point of what is going on. It's the action involved. It is what God told Jonah to originally do and what God told Jonah to do the second time. And then Jonah went and did, which is in chapter 3, he went and preached to the people of Nineveh. Okay? And so the people of Nineveh responded by putting on sackcloth and asking the Lord to forgive them. Okay? But that isn't the end of the story. We might think, okay, that's the end of the story. If Jonah was there, Jonah preached to the Ninevites, they responded, and all is well and good, story over. But that's not really the end, because we got chapter 4. And as a matter of fact, chapter 4 is really kind of the point to the book of Jonah. And so I think chapter 4 is kind of the most important chapter of the whole thing, because the point to the book of Jonah is not Jonah's actions of running to Tarshish, even though lessons can be learned from that. And it's not Jonah's obedience by going to Nineveh, even though lessons can be learned from that. And it's not even the people of Nineveh repenting before the Lord, even though lessons can be learned from that. The point to the book of Jonah is just simply what happens with Jonah later. Hi. And there she goes. Okay. All right. So, getting into chapter 4. All right. So, now what we see, Jonah's there in the city. He's preached. And what happens, and you notice, just going back into verse number 10, it says, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion and did not bring upon him the destruction he had threatened. Yea, story over, no, because verse 1 says, but Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. Okay? As a matter of fact, more literally translated, it's more that Jonah was displeased and had displeasure. I mean, it's not just simply that Jonah was irritated by what was going on. I mean, he was absolutely disgusted by what went on. I mean, from what went on, and what we've got to understand is what went on was that the people of Nineveh repented and God did not bring destruction on them. This was something that just, I mean, it wasn't just a little sand in Jonah's craw. I mean, this is something that was just completely something that rubbed him the wrong way. And because of that, he became angry. And we're not talking about a little bit of anger here. We are talking about a type of anger that is going to just absolutely disrupt his whole apple cart and disrupt his whole view on everything. Okay? So, in verse number 2, he prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, this is not what I said. Is this not what I said when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." And so, you know, we went back, and if you remember that very first, not the first lesson, but, well, maybe it was the very first lesson, we were talking about why did Jonah flee from Tarshish. And so, you know, a lot of times we get the idea that Jonah was fleeing from the idea about being called to be a prophet. And that really isn't why. Because we see right here the reason why Jonah did it. I mean, he's saying the reason why I was so quick to be disobedient to you, and the reason why I was so quick is to flee over to Tarshish is because he knew God's character. He knew who God was, you know, and who God was is that He's a gracious God. He is a compassionate God. He is a God who is slow to anger. He is a God who is abounding in love. He is a God who relents from sending calamity. Okay? So when you think about God, this is who God really is, isn't He? You know, there are sometimes that people will kind of think that, you know, here is the New Testament God, and the New Testament God is full of love and everything like that, and won't, you know, not going to judge, not going to do anything. But then the Old Testament God is that vengeful God that is going to always, well, wait a minute. It's you know, you got to kind of understand that God is God, that there is no different gods, that God is immutable. He does not change. And the same traits and characteristics that we see in the New Testament were in the Old Testament. The same traits and characteristics that we see in the Old Testament are in the New Testament. And that's the same thing with what we've got today. And so, yes, God is a God that will judge sin. God is a God that is holy. God is a God that is righteous. But God is also a God that is going to be gracious and compassionate. He's going to be a God who is slow to anger. He's going to be a God that is abounding in love. And He is going to relent from sending judgment when it's warranted. Now, if you think about it, aren't you glad that God is a God like that? I am, because I'm glad that God treats me this way, right? Okay? But here's the thing. Why would God treat me that way? Is it because I'm so special? Is it because there is something about me that God is just enamored with? As a matter of fact, why is God enamored with us anyway, to be this way? It's because we're His creation, right? Right, okay. So if we're His creation, what about all the other people in the world? Right? Okay. What's that?
They are too.
They are too. And so God is a God who is like that to them. Now, can't you see that that is something that Jonah really didn't want, did he? Okay? And so that's the reason why he didn't want to go to Nineveh. After spending 3 days and 3 nights in the fish, he decided, yeah, I'm going to do what God wants me to, even though I don't want to do it. But you can see in chapter 3, when he went through the streets of Nineveh preaching, he didn't want to do it. Okay? I mean, as we looked at it, he didn't even say repent. He didn't even plead with the people. He just said, 40 days, God's going to overthrow this city. It's just, that's it. I'm doing what I have to do, and that's all that there is to it. Okay? And so I want you to take a look at verse number 3. I mean, when we talk about Jonah being upset, this is how upset he is. Okay? In verse number 3, he says, "Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." So that's what I'm saying. Jonah is not just simply mad about something. He is so angry that he is willing to just give up on life. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. Who is Jonah angry at? Is he angry at God? No, he's not, is he? Because he knows that this is what God was going to do. So it's not as if he thought God was going to do one thing and wound up doing something different, and then was angry at God for being inconsistent with what he thought. No, he knew God was going to do this, and that was the reason why he wanted to run away to begin with. Who is he angry at? Or what is he angry at? Well, maybe so. I mean, he didn't like the Ninevites, but I think he is maybe angry at the situation more than the Ninevites, number one. And the fact is that they repented and God wasn't going to destroy them. But do you think that he had a little bit of anger towards himself? Okay? Because if his anger was solely directed at the Ninevites, he probably would say, Lord, please judge them anyway, right? Please destroy them anyway. But what he's really saying is, take away my life. And when you look at this, understand that word better there is really just talking about good, okay? So he's saying, death is good for me more than life is good for me. So he's saying, I'd be better off dead than alive right now. If you want to know good, my goodness involves my death, not my life. So you see why I'm saying he's probably angry at himself for a little bit, even though he did what God wanted him to do. So the question is, why is Jonah so angry at this? I mean, he obviously doesn't like Gentiles and Ninevites, but I mean, is it to that point that he's willing to say that? You know, again, understand that God used the Assyrians to judge and destroy his own people, the northern kingdom, the Israelites, maybe about 75 years from now. And so here is Jonah. He may be thinking, I'm partly responsible for this. People, when they hear this, they're not going to, they maybe they'll understand why I'm going to go to Nineveh and preach to them, right? Maybe he feels like he has betrayed his family, friends, and countrymen. Do you see the idea about what's going on in Jonah's mind here, right? Okay, you guys got any questions about that before we move on? Verse number 4. Okay, verse number 4. Look at how God responds to him. He says this, have you any right to be angry? Now, we're not talking about a right as far as like a constitutional right type thing. Instead, what we're talking about here is, do you have any good reason for this? Is your reasoning that you've got, is this a good line of reasoning? Do you have a real legitimate concern here? Or is your anger that you've got, is this something that is really justified? Okay? And so the Lord just simply asks him this question, do you have a right? And how does Jonah respond? He doesn't, does he? He's just like, have you ever, been talking with a kid or something, one of your kids, and you're talking with them, and they really don't have a response. They don't have a good answer, but they're just so mad that they just walk off. Or you're talking to a coworker or something, and you're having a disagreement, and you say something that they just don't have any response for, and so they just walk off. Okay, well that's what it is with Jonah here, and that is that God is saying you don't have a right to be angry, but put it in a question of, do you have a right to be angry? And Jonah, pretty much knows the answer here, but he can't even wrap his head around it at this point. Okay, so what does Jonah do? What we see in verses 5 through 8 is that here's a very interesting object lesson that God sends to Jonah. The book of Jonah really is involving 4 different object lessons. One was already done with the fish. Now we've got 3 more that are going to go. In verse number 5, it says, Jonah went out and sat down in a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat in its shade and waited to see what would happen to the city. Now, the shelter that Jonah made, it's just a shelter. So I really don't know exactly what kind of shelter it is. We've got something that's kind of, semi-arid climate, And so, you know, it's not like you can go and get a bunch of you know, trees and everything like that. One person that I read talked about how he went out and made bricks and everything like that and built bricks. But I don't really see that, you know, because it sounds to me that he went and he probably found some branches, you know, some little scrub brush, you know, and just kind of made a little lean-to there, you know, and just sat down on the east of the city. And I kind of get the feeling that Jonah knows what's going to happen, but at the same time, there's just that little element of hope there of maybe I'm wrong, and maybe, you know, just maybe God is going to take care of the city. It's almost like, you know, with me watching a football game, and, you know, I'm rooting for my team, and my team is behind 3 scores in the 4th quarter with 2 minutes remaining, and they've got the ball, and it's 3rd and 15 on their 30-yard line, and I'm like, it's over. It's over. I'm going to turn. Wait a minute. Maybe. You know, I keep watching. Maybe they're going to pull this out. So it's kind of like that, okay? And so I think that's what is going through Jonah's mind. So he's sitting down here, and he's got this little bitty shelter, but you kind of think that this shelter is probably just some sticks that are there. And, you know, I guess it's better than nothing, but at the same time, is it really protecting you from the sun and everything? Not really. So notice that it says in verse number 6, then the Lord provided a vine and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And so here we've got this vine, and I'm envisioning this very lush, leafy vine that is grown up all over this little shelter that he's got, built up there. And if you think about this, if they're in a semi-arid place, what's the chances of a lush vine just happening to grow up right there? No, I mean, this is something that what it says here is that God provided. Okay, that word provided is the same word that we see in chapter 1 in verse number 17, where it says, but the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. So we've got God providing a fish, God providing a vine, and we've got 2 other things that God's going to provide too. But when God provides that vine, I mean, this is something that is, you know, giving Jonah, I'm not going to say, you know, a nice vacation spot, but it's giving him some relief. So what it says here is that it grows up over Jonah to give him shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. So here he is in his anger, in his displeasure. Here he is, I just want to die. And then all of a sudden, you know, we got some shade. And Jonah's kind of happy at this point in stage. Okay? All right. But then what happens? In verse number 7, it says, but at dawn the next day, God provided a worm. So here's that other little thing that God provides. So we've got a story of a great fish, we've got a story of a vine, and now we've got a story of a worm too. Now, I don't think that this was just some ordinary worm because, man, this worm had an appetite or something. Okay, because it says, but at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the vine so that it withered. And so here it is at dawn, you know, Jonah may be waking up to the sounds of munching. Munch, what's going on? I don't know, I'm going back to sleep. And if he wakes up, you know, when the sun's up, it's like, what happened to my vine? Where did my vine go? Okay, all right. So notice that here is something God gave him. Now it's something God took away. But again, there's the third thing. Here's the fourth thing. In verse number 8, it says, when the sun rose, God provided, this is again something that God is doing, a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head. Now, I read something that in the Middle East, there are these winds, and what this guy was talking about is that, you know, sometimes people would think that this is going to be a very hot, very violent wind. I mean, it's a very strong wind. But he was saying that this is not what this was. I was looking for it because I remember reading something many, many years ago, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a commentator that was talking about a weather phenomenon. You know, here you've got, as a matter of fact, here we'll use this for something right here, right? Boy, we've got stuff all over the place. You have the Tigris River that's coming down, and Nineveh was located on the eastern side of it. By the way, Mosul, old city of Mosul would have been on this side. The modern day city of Mosul is kind of encompassing the whole area. But Jonah is sitting down here on the east of the city. Now, since this is a river valley, the terrain is going up all the way until many miles away until you get mountains. But what this commentator was saying is that sometimes there's this weather phenomenon where air would come over the desert, and then as it was coming down, it compresses. And so what I was talking about or reading last night was a commentator saying that he has been in that kind of situation where it just all of a sudden it gets just brutally hot and brutally stuffy. I'm kind of, you know, it's almost like, you know, here we've got all this heat going on this week, so it's almost like, you know, we've got something to relate to, right? But, you know, here's this just brutal heat that is there, but it's not, you know, hazy like what we've had. Instead, it is a hot, drying wind or hot, drying atmosphere, and the sun is just beating down on his head so that he grew faint. And so here is Jonah, and he's experiencing, you know, heat exhaustion at this point. And so what does he say? He says he wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." What's happening to Nineveh is not what he wanted it to happen. He wanted to die instead of living. It would be better for him to die than to live. Okay, I got a little bit of relief. No, I don't have relief from the sun. Now it's coming back to me even twice as much, and it is just hot and miserable, and it would just be better for me to die than to live. Okay? So you kind of understand what Jonah is going through. I mean, I'm not asking if you relate to that or have related to it any time, but I mean, can you at least kind of, you know, sympathize with what he is feeling at this point in time? Right? Okay, so let's look at verse number 9. In verse number 9, but God said to Jonah, "Do you have a right to be angry?" Same thing as what he answered before, but do you see those last little words there? Now he's narrowing it down. He's saying about the vine. Not about Nineveh, not about the situation, but do you have a right to be angry about the vine? Do you have a good reason to be angry about the vine? So now I'm asking you that question. Does Jonah have a good reason to be angry about the vine? I mean, after all, the vine gave him comfort, and now the vine does not give him comfort. So if you look at it that regard, you know, it's like, well, maybe he has a right to be angry about the vine because, you know, it was there, it was giving him a little bit of peace, and then God took it away. God took it away with the worm, and God took it away with the wind. So does he have a right to be angry about the vine?
He's more concerned about destruction of a plant instead of 120,000 people.
Okay, so let's look at what he answers. What he answers is, "I do," he said. "I am angry enough to die." So he's right back where he was before, right? You know, I've got a right to be angry about this vine, right? I am so angry that it would be better for me to die than to live because of this stupid vine. Okay, so how does God answer? But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. So here's Jonah, and God's just saying, you say you've got a right to be angry about this vine, but you didn't do anything to have this vine. You didn't plant it, you didn't water it, you didn't tend it, you didn't cultivate it, it was just there, right? It was there, and you enjoyed its shade, and it's gone. And now you're right back where you were before. So you're concerned about this vine, even though you really didn't have anything to do with this vine. But he goes on to say this, but Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left hand. Now, this doesn't mean that they were a bunch of imbeciles. You know, they were intelligent people and skilled in engineering and everything like that. So that's not what God was talking about. What God's talking about is spiritual knowledge, spiritual acuity. They were complete babes as far as the knowledge of Him. So much so that they couldn't even tell their right hand from the left hand in terms of spiritual things. And so he's saying, you know, here are these people, 120,000 people who are spiritual imbeciles. And he says, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? Jonah, you're concerned about the vine, even though it's my vine. But here's my people over there. And should I not be concerned about that? Now, shouldn't Jonah be concerned about what God's concerned about? Right? And he's not. Okay? Notice the story ends right there. Okay? So, this story of the book of Jonah, who is it really for? Is this story really about Jonah? Or really is the inspiring of this story for other people? Who do you suppose this was for back when it was written? Because, you know, one thing that we need to understand is that when we look at the Bible, we need to figure out, you know, try to understand, you know, what did the original writer mean when he was writing it to the original recipients? And so here are the original recipients, and who do you suppose those people would be? Well, it would be the nation of Israel, right? Because, you know, Jonah is a prophet, and it was written to people there in the northern kingdom. So what do you think this message would be telling them? Especially after 722 BC, after the Assyrians destroyed Israel.
And don't run from obedience to God, because you'll bring on unnecessary hardship.
Well, that is a point that's in chapters 1 and 2. But the point that we're looking at in chapter 4 is,
God, it should matter to us.
If it matters to God, it matters to us. And that God is concerned with everybody, not just simply some people.
And that's what we should be.
And that's the way that we should be too. And that's where we start to think about us, right? You know, here are these enemies of Israel that destroyed Israel. And by the way, God goes on later to destroy Assyria too. But here are the people that God is concerned about them. And God is being willing to be compassionate and gracious to them just the same as He was to Israel. Now we can start to take a look at us, right? Do we have a right to look at any one person, whether it's racial, whether it's societal, whether it's national with different countries? Do we have a right to look at any person and say, you don't deserve a relationship with God? Nope. Because He's the same creator of them as He is us. And if God is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in love to us, then He is that way to other people as well. Right? And so, yes, sir.
Why do you mention at the end there about the cattle?
Well, because cattle are God's creation too. If God was going to overthrow the city, I mean, like, Sodom and Gomorrah style, the cattle's going to be destroyed too.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, those cattle are God's creation too. And so, he's looking at it in terms of, if I destroy this place, then everything's going to be destroyed. But God really doesn't want to destroy Nineveh, does he? Because he cares about the people there, and he cares about his creation. He does not care about their wicked ways. As a matter of fact, he detests their wicked ways, and that's the reason why he is going to do that anyway, right? But if they were to repent, he would say, I'm going to give them time. I'm not going to bring about the destruction that I want. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, let's talk for just a second about Jesus saying to his disciples, to us, that we are to love our enemies. Okay? Why should we love our enemies?
Because God cares about them.
Because God loves them. Right? And if we're going to be godly, if we're going to follow Christ, then we're going to do the same things that God does. We're going to do the same things that Christ does. Okay? One thing that strikes me is that you read about stories of people's persecution and being put to death down throughout the ages, Christians that is, and how many times they would be witnessing to the very people that would be killing them, and they would be shouting out, trying to urge the crowd and urge family members, to follow Christ, but the very fact that they would be out there, trying to witness to the people who would try to kill them, isn't that a very striking thing? And so here's a scenario for you, and I don't try to say that this is going to happen in our future, but I am going to say it could happen in our future. But let's say that the end time events draw nigh, and if you're beginning of the weaker, then you're going to say this is going to happen before the Antichrist takes power. If you're not, then you can say when the Antichrist takes power. If you don't know what the beginning of the weaker and the end of the weaker is, you can put down that as a question. We'll talk about it. Okay? But you can see that as the end time events approach, we are probably going to face more and more persecution. So I just want you to envision yourself as saying, if this is going to occur within our lifetime, and we are there, witnessing the persecution of our loved ones, or if we are there witnessing our own persecution, what would we be thinking and doing to the people that are doing the persecuting? Would we be thinking, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do? Or would we be thinking, God, come strike them down? You see this? When you put it like that, the book of Jonah has a little bit more teeth to it than what you think, right? Okay. You guys got any questions? Comments about it?
I don't know. I still think, though, that Jonah had some of his anger was toward God. Because even though,
Maybe so.
because he wanted him to do this and he didn't do it. But he knew he wasn't going to, but yet.
I mean, when you think about people being so angry that they get to the point that Jonah's at, it's just spreading all over the place. So I'm not saying that he didn't have any anger directed at God, but his main anger is not directed at God. His main anger is, and as a matter of fact, when you go back to verse number 1, where it says, but Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. When you look at other translations, it says that it caused displeasure. It made Jonah displeased. And what's it? It is the situation. And so he's angry at the situation, and he's involved in that situation because he was part of it. And that's where he's saying, this is why I didn't want to go to Nineveh to begin with, why I fled to Tarshish. Okay? But I'm sure that he was perturbed at God too. Okay? But if he was so mad at God, then he probably isn't going to be, having any kind of conversation with God. So, which he didn't, the very first verse. He just, okay. All right, other people have questions or comments?
Sometimes when we're, I want to say, angry or thinking, why is that evil person getting away with things?
Yeah.
It's not easy, but sometimes we need to step back, and I think we don't know what they've been through, what they've experienced, what's causing them to act that way.
Right.
And that's why we have to try and be compassionate and show love, and show them love so that they can learn to love or whatever.
Right. And that's not supposed to excuse what they do, too. I mean,
vengeance is mine.
It is. It is. Anybody else?